So I'm just going to speak for the next 10-15 minutes. And Paul, if you can just give me a time check, because you know what I'm like once I get going.
Okay.
Just in terms of the triage too, that I'm working with foundations and also the team that I'm working with in Calderdale on. So why develop a triage tool? Lauren's kind of has mentioned that when we've recently got the feedback from Adaptations Without Delay, one of the feedback that we've got is it's a great document, but actually we need some tools to support that. So I'm hoping that the triage tool is one of those tools that can kind of support people implementing the adaptations without delay. But what we do know from the DFG review and from adaptations without delay is this need to ensure that we're making the best use of the occupational therapy resource that we've got in social care and housing. And at the end of the day, there's always going to be far too much work that we can possibly do as occupational therapists. So we need to ensure that we're using that resource in the right way. And when I was involved in the DFG review and the adaptation without delay, I was in the wonderful world of academia, but I'm now a principal OT in Calderdale. So I'm living in the real world, as it were. Not that I wasn't living in the real world before, but I'm obviously having to kind of deal with the resources that we've got. And at the end of the day, we're not the only profession that uses triage tool to make the best use of resources. And there's lots of triage tools that are used both in health and social care. So the purpose of the tool, so it's a tool to support decision making and to help determine who should be involved in that process. So if you remember adaptation without delay, we talked about a universal, targeted and specialist services, and you know who should be involved in those different types of services. So the triage tool is a decision making tool that helps us determine who should be involved in the process and what kind of service somebody should need. It's not a tool for prioritizing the urgency of cases. It's not a tool for being able to identify if somebody actually needs an adaptation, and I know foundations are working on that at the moment in terms of that self-assessment tool. But the triage tool isn't around whether somebody needs an adaptation or not, and it's not a wait list management tool either. So it's only a tool for helping determine who should be involved in the DFG process. So what we want the outcome of the triage tool to be is obviously to support that timely decision on who should be involved in the process based on that complexity of the person's situation. What we want it to be as well is it supports the whole kind of ethos around the Care Act, which is about that proportionate response. So hopefully that the triage tool is enabling us to provide that proportionate response. Ultimately, you know, it's about better use of the workforce and skills that we've got out there, and making better use of those OT skills, our caseworker skills and our technical officer skills. So it's making best use of the workforce skills so that we can really get an effective DFG process. The other thing that I want it to be is an evidence-based decision tool as well, and that it's not just something that we kind of have plucked out of the air, as it were. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute in terms of you know, the evidence base that we've used to develop the tool. So it does, like any tool, it does have its limitations. At the moment, I can see those limitations are that it is focused on the DFG process. So for those working in independent practice, it's probably not a tool relevant for yourselves. It is very much focused on the DFG process. So I don't know if we've got any colleagues from the other three nations. I suppose there will be some overlaps, but it is in developing, it was very much around the DFG process. At the end of the day, it's only as good as the person administering the tool, and we can talk a little bit, and it'll be really good to get some feedback from yourselves at the end, but it is only as good as the people administering the tool. There is an assumption behind the tool that if OTs aren't going to be involved, that people involved in the DFG process, so caseworkers, technical officers, have got that as trusted assessor training and know when they're working beyond their scope of practice. And at the end of the day, it's like any new tool, we need to look at auditing and monitoring whether there is any adverse instance or adverse outcomes from using the tool. Just in terms of developing, we used Ainsworth and Dijon, who we use quite heavily. They work quite heavily in adaptations without delay. I've used their work again because they did an awful lot of work around complexity, what makes something a simple adaptation compared to what makes something complex. So in terms of an evidence base, we've used their work, or I've used their work to help come up with the triage tool. Again, what we've done is underpinning that tool is whether somebody is able to manage the adaptation themselves or with kind of minimal support from caseworkers, so that universal type service, whether they need a more targeted and specialist input. It's a triage tool that is more of a conversation, and it's based around 7 questions, once again, that falls out of Ainsworth and Dijon's work. And again, the responses indicate whether somebody needs a universal, targeted or specialist approach, or which approach is most appropriate, with the idea that if it's kind of more greens, it's more of a universal types approach that somebody can use in terms of the DFG. If there's more amber, then it's probably more targeted, or if there's red flags, then it's more of a specialist and more of an integrated approach that we need to support that adaptation process. So if we go on now, I'm just going to go through. So these are the 7 questions that the triage tool is based around. So the first one is, will it support, what support will the person need to actually identify and design the adaptations? One of the things that I will say is that I've taken a very personalised approach that is actually, which again we try to do with adaptations without delay. It's this assumption that most of the people that we work with are quite capable in terms of understanding their needs. So it is very, so some of these questions is about actually the person being very much in the driving seat of the DFG process. So the first question is, what support will the person need to identify and design the adaptation? Second question is, will the adaptations impact on anyone else living or using the property? Third question is, will the person need help or additional equipment to use the adaptation? So for example, if once the adaptations is installed, is there going to be additional bits of specialist equipment that the person's also going to need to use in the adaptation? What number of adaptations are required is the fourth question. What support will the person need during the actual kind of once the adaptations go on site? What kind of support will they need during the DFG process, in terms of doing all the financial bits and pieces, and also working with the contractors as well? What kind of support will they need? Sixth question is, how adaptable is the property itself? And the final question is, how could the tenure ship of the tenure ship of the property the person living in affect the DFG process? So what I'm going to quickly do is just whiz through the responses that are available for each question. So if we go to the first question, so what support will the person need? So somebody that is kind of looking like they could manage the DFG process themselves is somebody who's got a really good understanding of their condition and can identify what adaptations will meet their short and long-term needs. So long-term needs being around 5 years. So you can see why this is much more of a conversational triage tool than being very strict yes or no. One of the things that I want to do to support the tool under this question is kind of have like a persona description of what that person might look like, which I know is very kind of medical model, but hopefully it kind of supports the person administering the triage. So somebody that might need a more targeted is the person has a really good understanding of their condition, but might need advice on what adaptations are necessary and appropriate to meet their needs. And then perhaps where there's a bit of a red flag where we might need more of an OT input is where the person needs advice to understand how their condition will affect the types of adaptations they need and how the adaptations should be designed to meet their short and long-term needs. So if we go on to the next question and responses. So will the adaptation impact on anyone else living or using the property? So this is where it's more of a universal green flag, is where the installation of the adaptation will have no impact or very little impact on those that live in the property. Where we might beginning to think about whether somebody might need targeted is where perhaps there will be some impact on those living in the property. So where we work in Calderdale, we have quite a number of multi-generational families. So actually, if we start taking out the bath, then that actually might have an impact on the other generations living in that property. And a red flag is where actually if we install the adaptation, it could prevent those living in the property doing some of those everyday activities that are important to them. Sorry, this is a bit small. It's probably all testing your eyesight now. So will the person need help or additional equipment to use the adaptation? So again, a green flag is where once installed, the person won't need any support to use the adaptation, or where there's no need for additional equipment. So this might be, somebody where we're putting in a wet room for somebody with osteoarthritis, and we know once we've got everything installed, they're going to be independent, and they're not going to need any additional equipment. Again, the next amber is where it's likely that the person might need some assistance in the future, or where it's likely that they might need some equipment. And then the red flag is where actually the person's already having assistance, and actually we might need to take that into account when we're designing the adaptation, or if they've got specialist equipment where we're needing to take that into account in terms of the design. And again, what you'll see in all these is what I'm wanting to do is to provide some examples to just help frame that a little clearer. So what number of adaptations are required? So this is, I know foundations have done some fantastic kind of research, and what we know is that the common 80%, I think Paul will correct me if I'm wrong, but about 85% of adaptations are one of three adaptations or a combination of three, which are ramps, stair lifts and showers. So again, they're really kind of commonly available. So again, a green flag is where there are one or two types of adaptations which are commonly available. So we know that the builders, contractors are used to installing those bits and pieces. Perhaps where somebody might need a more targeted approach, where we need to just be thinking perhaps differently, is where there might be three or more areas of the home needing to be adapted. And then a red flag is if where we're actually anticipating, given the person's needs, potentially we're going to require extensive remodeling to actually accommodate the adaptations that are required. So once again, that's another red flag. What support will the person need during the DFG process and to work with contractors? So this is where, I think we're all doing remodeling jobs more and more now, particularly during the lockdown. So actually people are really experienced with renovating or remodeling. And if they aren't, then often they have got family members who are, and they're actually really comfortable with working with contractors with sorting out the financial bit. So that green flag is somebody who's had perhaps they've previously had adaptations or experience renovating their house and are happy to kind of make those important decisions around the DFG process, and are able to really communicate, if not themselves or have got family, to communicate with contractors. Amber, where somebody might need support, is again where the person can make those decisions, but actually they want some support in different aspects of administrating the different bits of the DFG, and may need some support with working with contractors. And then the red flag is where actually somebody needs support to help them make decisions during the different aspects of the DFG process, or all aspects. and including when they're working with contractors. How adaptable is the property? I do wonder whether we need this one given the question that we've got around the number of adaptations. So it may be that this might be one that we could drop, given we've got that one around how many adaptations, and it would be good to get some of your feedback. You know, we anticipate that there's going to be enough space to install adaptations. So I don't know if there's any colleagues from West Yorkshire, but some of our property housing stock, we've got the old back-to-backs. So often there is restrictions in common adaptation, so that's why I've actually kept it in for now. Again, actually, if we're not too sure whether the property is adaptable, because remember this is a triage tool, so where we're kind of thinking that maybe some restrictions and we might need to get a survey in to check the space, so that's there. And then the red flag is where we know that there is insufficient space, perhaps by using Google Maps, etc. Or to be honest, colleagues, our technical officers and our case managers, certainly in Calderdale, we've got housing types, so we tend to know whether there's going to be an issue or not. And then finally, how could the tenure ship affect the DFG process? So again, I'm making huge assumptions here, but often what we do know is somebody is owner occupied, then that tends to be where we have less issues around gaining permission and consent to do the work. Obviously, if we've got a landlord, it's likely we need, from a case manager point of view, probably going to need to do a little bit more work. But if we know that the landlord is supporting at the beginning, when somebody puts in, you know, contacts us around an adaptation, if we, you know, have that conversation, have you got a supportive landlord, then that's obviously kind of, you know, hopefully it's going to be a more smooth journey. And a clear red flag is, you know, where we've perhaps got a landlord who isn't aware about the DFG, or who's actually raised some concerns about, you know, the person having their tenant and having the property adapted, and so that's where we know we're probably going to need to do more specialist work with the landlord to kind of give them some reassurance and to help them through that DFG process. So those are the 7 questions. So this is where we're going to need to do some more work. So it'd be really good if at the end of today, if there are, you know, 3 or 4 places that would be interested in kind of helping us pilot this triage tool. My thinking is, if we've got somebody with like 4 or more green flags, then that's probably indicating that somebody just requires that universal approach. So where, you know, it's that, and I'm saying minimal support here, and I apologise to any caseworkers because I know how skilled you guys are, but it is your input that probably is all that is required to support that person through that DFG process for those simpler adaptations. Where perhaps we're getting 3 or more orange flags, then that probably is indicating where, you know, somebody needs a more targeted approach. So it could perhaps be managed by a technical officer, as long, or the OT, as long as we've got that level 4 trusted assessor input. And then I think if anybody has got 1 or more red flags, I think there's an indication potentially that actually is this where we need to get that wrap around that integrated approach in the for that individual. But it would be really good to get 2 or 3 people who would be interested in piloting the triage tool to kind of help us kind of develop now, kind of, you know, being able to implement that. Yeah, next steps are, I know I spoke to Francis Paul, I think it might have been Friday, where we said what we might do is, because obviously we probably haven't got time here, but to have a specific feedback session.
And there is some work underway to link this to a kind of prioritization tool and kind of timescale tool as well. So
that's why I made that point at the beginning, because I think that, I think there needs to be a suite of tools that supports the DFG process. So for me, this is that bit when somebody's coming in, can we get them to the right person? Yeah.
Yes, great. Well, thank you as always, Rachel. Thank you for joining us while you're on holiday.
That's all right. And I managed to keep to time, which is even more of a miracle.
Perfect. So I mean, I only see you on conferences these days, so yeah, it'd be good to meet up. I guess when we can, and yeah, keep developing this tool and get it out there for people to start to use. And if anybody is interested in piloting it, then please do put your notes in the chat box.